This movie is about sharing a workbook with multiple simultaneous users. And yeah, you can do that. One of the downsides to doing this is there's a lot of limitations as to what you can do and what you can't do. And we'll take a look at that list. And then we'll take a look at the settings for sharing a workbook, including adding a password to protect that state. We'll look at highlighting the changes and viewing the change history. And then we'll look at accepting and rejecting the changes that have been made. So sharing a workbook and limitations. First off, you can't share a workbook at all if you have a table or XML data. In fact, if you try by left-clicking Share, I put a table in so I can show you this error message. The workbook cannot be shared because it contains tables or Excel maps. To share the workbook, convert the table to ranges and remove the XML maps. I'm going to left-click OK. I'm going to select that table and convert it to a range. Of course, that doesn't get rid of the formatting, so it looks like it's still a table, but if you saw the movies on tables, you'd know that. So now I'm able to share the workbook, but we're not going to do that quite yet. Because the other limitations are, once you share a workbook, there's sort of a laundry list of things that you can't do. Like add or change conditional formats, data validations, add or change Excel 4 dialog sheets, assign, change, or remove passwords, change or delete array formulas, create an Excel table, create a data table, create or change charts or pivot reports, create or change pivot table reports, create or change or view scenarios, delete worksheets, group or outline the data, insert automatic subtotals, insert or change hyperlinks, or pictures or other objects, insert, delete blocks of cells, merge cells or split merged cells, protect or unprotect the worksheets or the workbook, use a data form to add new data, use drawing tools, work with XML data, or write, record, change, view, or assign a macro. So what can you do? Basically, you can enter data, and you can utilize some of these things that are on this list if they're already set up in the workbook. And you can also allow users to maintain their own print settings and allow them to maintain their own filter settings. So how do we go about sharing a workbook? We go to the Review tab, and in the Changes group, left-click Share Workbook, and check this checkbox that says Allow changes by more than one user at a time. This also allows workbook merging, which we covered in the prior movie. And at any point in time, you can refer to this box to see who has the workbook open. In fact, that's true even if the workbook is not shared, because currently it's not shared. I have the workbook open in exclusive mode, and I'm on that list. If later on you have a shared workbook where somebody has it open, and let's say they didn't close it and they went on vacation, you could bump them off by referring to this list and then left-click Remove User. So once we check that checkbox, we can go to the Advanced tab. The first settings have to do with maintaining a change history. The default is 30 days. You can keep a change history for up to 10,000 days. Why you'd ever need to do that, I'm not sure. And you can also choose to not keep a change history at all, which is probably not a good idea either. The second group has to do with when the spreadsheet recognizes changes being made. You can leave it at the default setting, and that is the spreadsheet will be updated when the file is saved, or you can have it automatically update for the changes every X number of minutes, the default being 15. You can decrease this interval of time down as low as 5 minutes and increase it up to 1,440 minutes or 12 hours. With this selected, you can choose to have changes that other people and yourself are making, or you can click this radio button and just see the changes being made by other people. Those two settings can be useful if you have multiple people accessing the same content, the same worksheet in the workbook. Many times shared workbooks are distributed where individuals have access to their own region, their own range, or their own worksheet. If that isn't the case and multiple people are accessing the same content, you may have a conflict where somebody's trying to change a cell that somebody else already put a change in for. If that's the case, you can have conflicts resolved by either asking the person which change wins and leaving it up to them, or you can have the last change that was saved win. And lastly, each one of the individuals can set up their own personal settings by way of print settings and filter settings. So I'm going to left click OK. This action will now save the workbook. Do you want to continue? I'm going to left click OK. This workbook is now in a shared state. After sharing it, I can left click Protect Shared Workbook, and there's a series of protections that you can set up for your workbook. If you have other protection settings that you want to set up for your worksheets and your workbook, you need to do that first in that order. First set up the protection settings for the worksheet, and then the workbook, and then you can turn to this dialog box to protect the workbook from anybody being able to change the state of it being shared, which also protects the change history. And you can establish a password if you want to. Because once you unshare the workbook, you lose all the change history. So I'm going to left click that and acknowledge that. So our workbook is shared, and we've protected the fact that the workbook is shared. And now I'm going to make a couple of changes. I'm going to left click and select the list and bold it all. And I'm going to copy and paste a couple of the items in column C. So I've made some changes. They haven't yet been incorporated into the workbook, but they have been logged in the change history. So I can left click Track Changes and then left click Highlight Changes, where I get a dialog box that allows me to select what changes I want to highlight. Since I last saved the workbook, all of them, the ones that haven't been reviewed yet, or since a given date, I can then select from who do I want to see the changes by. I have three options: everyone, everyone but me, or me. And then lastly, I can select a given range that I want to see the changes for. And so we can see all the changes I made. I'm going to select the entire range. And then I have two more settings where I can have the changes highlighted on the screen, which is selected by default, and or I can have the changes listed on a new worksheet. So I'm going to left click OK, and I get a warning message from Excel that only changes which have been saved can be listed on the history sheet. I'm going to left click OK, and since I didn't save any of these changes, they're not going to be logged in as far as the change history goes, because the changes really haven't taken effect. This is just like working in your workbook when you're making changes. Until you save it, your changes are active or recognized in RAM, random access memory, but they won't be maintained unless you save the workbook. So I'm going to save the workbook. So I'm going to go back to Track Changes, Highlight Changes, and this time I need to select not since I last saved, because I haven't made any changes since I last saved the workbook. I want to see all of the changes, and I want to list the changes on a new worksheet as well as having them highlighted on the worksheet where the changes were made. Left clicking OK, Excel inserts a new worksheet and calls it History. It has the date, the time when the change was made, who made the change, what the change was, which worksheet was changed, and what range or cell was changed. And in this case, I created a new value for these three cells. Those new values are listed there. The old value was blank, and this is one good reason why it's good to maintain a change history, because you keep a log of the prior values for these cells, so that if you ever need to roll back a cell to its prior value, you'll have that value listed in the change history. Going back to the spreadsheet where the changes were made, the changes are called out with a border around each of the cell and a comment, in effect, saying who did the change, when it took place, at what time, and what the change was. So the last thing that can be done is an administrator can come through, left-click Track Changes, and then left-click Accept Reject Changes. The default setting for selecting which changes to accept and reject are all the changes that have not yet been reviewed by everybody, and the range that I selected to find the changes for is by default listed here as well. I'm going to left-click OK, and Excel will display for me each change in the order that it was made. and I can choose to accept the change, reject the change. I can accept all of the changes, or I can reject all of the changes. So I'm going to accept the first one and reject the second one and reject the third one. I can save the workbook. To get rid of that call out on the change for cell C15, go back to Track Changes, highlight Changes, and then clear this checkbox, highlight Changes on Screen, left-click OK. To unshare the workbook, left-click Share Workbook, and then clear this checkbox. When you do that, however, you'll lose all of the change history, and anybody that has not yet incorporated their changes into the workbook will not be able to do so. As a side note, if somebody has the shared workbook open and they're disconnected from the network, or they have an independent copy of the shared workbook, you can still incorporate their changes into this workbook by merging the changes into the workbook, and that functionality was covered in the prior movie. So I'm going to clear this checkbox, left-click OK, and Excel will tell me that the action will remove the workbook from shared use, the change history will be erased, and other users who are editing this workbook will not be able to save their changes, even if you share the workbook again. So that's sharing a workbook. We first went over the limitations of sharing a workbook, and there's a sort of a laundry list of things that you can't change in a shared workbook. We looked at the settings for sharing a workbook, which includes tracking the changes in the change history, determining when the workbook is updated, determining how conflicts are resolved, and allowing users to set up their own print and filtering settings. Once we made some changes, we went to the Track Changes functionality, where we can highlight the changes made by having Excel add callouts on the screen where the changes took place, and or having Excel adding a change history to the workbook. And lastly, we pulled up a list of the changes made where we could independently or universally accept and reject the changes.